sentencing reform and not be distracted by one-time experimental ideas and proposals which have a long-term and costly effect.
Okay, thank you, Shakyra. One last point just to, I think, build on that is that, you know, the very nature of private prisons may undermine sentencing reform. That their interest is in having a lot of prisoners to fill their facilities, and they are not interested necessarily in doing a lot of programming and other stuff that would help people get out of prison and not go back into prison. And so even though we do have some modest sentencing reforms being talked about in the state, those reforms could be undermined by private prisons that are handling our low-level offenders, that are the ones that we want to be sure to keep out of prison and not go back into prison, because their interest is in keeping the prisons filled to capacity to enhance their own revenues. So with that, we can go ahead and open up to any questions anybody has. Yes, sir.
Yeah, on private prisons, you talked about Texas. Are there not private prisons in the country, including, there are several in Ohio, I'm not familiar with their safety record or incident record. Are there not sort of best practices out there about how private prisons are being operated, not only in a particular location, but sort of systematically in a given state that are, that are being operated without the problems that you're talking about?
I'm not sure what's making that noise. I don't know if that's a question for me, but at least as to Texas, I can tell you that I'm not familiar. I imagine best practices exist there. The standards that are endorsed by organizations like the National Institute on Corrections and the National Correctional Medical Association. There are various standards that are promulgated, and most often I am familiar with private prisons failing to meet those standards, again because they save money in the bidding process by agreeing to bring in the prison on a certain bottom line and shift the cost to the back end to the eventual litigation or contract dispute. And that's sort of, they don't go in usually planning on meeting best practices. It's not what it's about. It's about preserving the bottom line.
Okay, well, I mean, that may be true, but that is a general statement.
Yes.
What I'm asking you is, have you not investigated, do you know in fact that there aren't private prison systems in other states or any state, including this state, that have demonstrated best practices?
I am not familiar with any that have. I know that, like the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, for example, we've been working on legislation to try to get oversight for them over private prisons, and I imagine that's the kind of information that might come out if we had statewide agency supervision over private prisons, but they have resisted that. So I am not familiar with any of that.
Okay, then just the last one. Then what about the record of the private prisons in this state, again, which I'm not familiar with?
We have 2 private prisons in the state of Ohio that are state managed but owned by MTC. That's Lake Erie North Coast. They do not have trauma recovery programs. They do not have job training programs. They do not have mental illness programming. They do not have disease management programming or general health.
Could you say that again?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Trauma recovery programming, job training, mental illness programming, and disease management. Now, those prisons are 100% capacity, which is, that's good.
That's low for our state.
But half of our prisons are over 100% capacity. So where we may see some, these 2 prisons are doing pretty good, it's because half of the rest of the other prisons are over capacity. Lorraine, for example, is 200% over capacity.
But there have been significant safety problems. I mean, they've been open for 11 years, and the safety and contract issues you're talking about was one GEO, and now MTC's had several.
Right. Well, and I think that's what Shakyra is getting at, that it has improved somewhat since it has shifted ownership, because they have changed the inmate population. One of the reasons that they're so successful is that both of those facilities can cherry pick the best inmates to have in their facilities. So the ones that are extremely low-level offenders, don't have a lot of medical issues, don't have a lot of behavioral or safety concerns. And so when they have the crowd of the best inmates and also can keep their numbers lower than other facilities, it's not necessarily a surprise that they may have less safety issues. But when we're talking to expanding that to 5 facilities, that could cause problems in the private facilities, but also if you're taking all of the best inmates into the private facilities, what happens to all the other facilities where all of the other inmates are as well? So I think that that's an issue too.
I had a question for Lisa, because I understand the last time I looked at the Texas Jail Standards Commission report, there were like 16,000 empty beds in Texas.
Exactly, and
So-
anybody who owns, I don't know what the number is today.
So is that, I mean, does it indicate that that the jail population, the prison population, the incarcerated population is going down in Texas?
It indicates 2 things, I think. I mean, one is that, the prison population is going down because some of the sentences, but because the rate of crime has gone down, even though the rate of incarceration has continued to climb in many places, but in Texas we have gotten a little bit smarter, not smart enough, I don't think, but a little bit smarter about de-incarceration and sentencing reform. But that is precisely what creates the panic among the private prisons to look for new business, because an empty bed is a lost dollar if it's a private prison facility. Which is why, especially in Texas, we've seen a huge expansion of the privates into immigration detention, because there's big dollars to be made there. But they are constantly looking for new business, whether it's mental health facilities, expanding into education and juvenile facilities. So those empty beds are, they're a success in a way for criminal justice reform, but they're a failure for the profit margin, and it causes the privates to become more and more aggressive about seeking new bodies.
The inmates in these institutions are criminals, and therefore, whether they have serious crimes or not serious crimes, they don't engender a lot of public sympathy. So what would you tell just average Ohioans about why they should care one way or the other? I mean, you've probably heard people say, well, I don't care what happens to those inmates. I don't care about their medical care or whatever. Why should I care about it, the issue? What do you tell people?
We don't need to make a compassion argument here. We can make a dollars and cents argument. If you leave people in a prison for 3 years with untreated tuberculosis, they do get out. And then they go to work at some fast food place with untreated tuberculosis. So we all end up not only paying, but we end up being exposed to their diseases. That's one very practical public health concern throughout the prison system, that when you put low-level offenders in with untreated MRSA, untreated tuberculosis, untreated STDs, we pay a huge public health bill as Lisa says, on the backside. It'd be so much simpler, so much cheaper to treat people. Forget about the compassion argument, the humanitarian concern. You can see the correctness in a pure dollars and cents term. The other aspect of this is that, remember, how these people are treated in prison is how they will be when they come out into the public. And you want people who've been treated like that living in your neighborhood, working next to you. Again, it's not a compassion argument. It's that, we treat pets better in order to be safe. We treat pets better than we treat human beings, simply from the safety concern. Again, not from the compassion concern.
To that end, 95% of the people who are incarcerated will be released. And our prisons are over capacity with that low-level nonviolent offender who typically does 6 to 9 months. They're not people who are there doing life in prison. They're not people there who are doing 20 years in prison. They're there for low-level nonviolent offenses that, although are being treated as criminals now, 20 years ago, those same offenses wouldn't have landed them in prison. It's a sentencing enhancement. It's a very punitive attitude that we have taken over the last 20 years that we need to pull back from.
And I would just add, Texas is certainly has a reputation for being an eye for an eye, show no mercy kind of state. But I think what has changed the conversation in Texas, and I would think would matter here in Ohio, is anybody who's a taxpayer ought to care. As Chris was saying, set the compassion arguments aside. Anybody who pays taxes in the state of Ohio ought to care where those tax dollars are going, and if they're being wasted on incarcerating people needlessly, and especially if they're just being transferred to the private pockets of prison providers. I think that's something that Ohio and Texas have in common.
I think one of the back that up some.
Well, because we are the largest incarcerator of people in the world, And many states are in the same situation that we're in. You know, they're finding that they've locked up too many people, that it's costing the states, all states, a tremendous amount of money. So folks around the country are looking to decriminalize, change their sentencing laws to reduce the number of people who are going in the first place.
Okay, well, I understand that. That's prison reform and so forth, and they're talking about that here in the Ohio legislature. But I thought maybe I misheard. I thought you were saying that on privatization, the issue of privatization, we have peaked and many states are moving in the opposite direction. Is that true? Did I mishear?
No, go ahead.
Well, I would just say in Texas, you know, the private prison industry was born in the 80s, had a huge upsurge during the war on drugs, peaked in the late 90s, and was in steep decline. CCA was losing money. Their profits dropped by like 40% in 99, and then has undergone another upswing on the anti-immigration tide. But I think that their efforts notwithstanding, their lobbying efforts notwithstanding, there's enough evidence at this point that the quality of care is so bad and the costs are not less but in fact more, that there is a shift. My understanding is that there is a shift nationally away from privatization. The BOP and the GAO, the federal agencies, BOP does have some contract facilities in the Government Accounting Office, has published a report saying that A, it's really hard to evaluate the privates because they resist transparency so strongly, but B, to the extent that there's evidence, the evidence is that they don't deliver on the promises that they make. And I think that's the result of a growing body of evidence, just in the last decade.
Okay, but again, I'm trying to nail it down. Do we have states, can you tell us about states that, you know, used to have private prisons, or they used to have 10, and and the government grabbed back 5 of them? I mean, is it?
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question. I'm not sure about that.
Phil, we've got a site in here, I'm just looking for it, so if it,
We have,